All right. Y'all come on in, grab a seat. You can start making your way in. We're going to start here in just about 3 minutes. But for those of you in the back, there's a lot of room in the front if you want to come on in. 3-minute countdown. All right. I'm going to kick the party off here for us. Come on in, grab a seat. If you haven't eaten yet, feel free to grab a plate. Drinks are in the back. Come on in. Well done. All right, as y'all are finding your seats, 2 quick, really important things at the beginning. This is my tactic to control the crowd. There we go. Hey, thank y'all so much for being here, for coming tonight, and hopefully also coming tomorrow morning. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Matt. I'm one of the pastors here, and I know recognize most of you. I know we have some visitors and friends that have also shown up for tonight, and welcome. So glad that you're here. Couple quick housekeeping deals before we get going is during Sam's presentation, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to text that question to this number up here on this board. We're going to allow time at the end to be able to ask those questions. And if you'd rather just ask it live, we'll give you that opportunity as well. But if you want to remain anonymous, feel free to do that, and we'll throw all the questions through that. So he'll present for a bit, and then I'll come up and I'll throw your questions at him. So that's deal number one. Deal number two is you may have noticed we have a small book table in the foyer back there. All of those are Sam's books that he has written, and those are available for purchase for $10. Eleanor Halliday is going to be back there, or someone's going to be back there, and you just Venmo Eleanor her the $10, and it's a great way to grab a great book and a cheaper book option. Sam just recently wrote a book called One with My Lord. I just recently read it, and it's primarily about the doctrine of union with Christ, which is maybe one of the most, if not the most central doctrine in the Bible, and yet it's one of the most overlooked and misunderstood, and he communicates it in a way that is extremely clear, extremely practical, extremely rich and thought-provoking, accessible. So I'd commend that to you. It's a great one, and I hope they run out quick, and then you have to go to Amazon or whatever and buy your own. But that's a great option. There's other options back there that are great as well. But before I introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, I do have one question. I should have asked you this beforehand. How do you pronounce your last name? Allberry? He's British, and so I was thinking, Americans say blueberry, and Brits say blueberry. Is that right? I looked this up online today. How do British people say blueberry, or strawberry? So I thought maybe it's Sam Allberry. Is that how? But that's not how you say it. That works. Okay. Okay. Well, I want to say some things about Sam. And I could say about Sam Allberry, I could say all of the traditional things that you could find out online about him. I could tell you that he's a pastor. He's an associate pastor over at Emmanuel in Nashville. Could tell you that he is a highly sought-after speaker, that he's a thought leader, he's an apologist. Could tell you that he's an author, and he's got all these books that he's written. Some of them are for sale back there. I can also tell you that he serves as a canon theologian for the Anglican Church in North America and as a fellow at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. I could tell you all that, but I'd rather tell you some non-traditional things that I've learned about Sam. These are things that you might not know and that you won't be able to find on the internet. So here are 8 things about Sam Allberry. I still don't know how to say it. Number 1, his first paid job was a gardener. Number 2, he hasn't changed his deodorant brand in 30 years. Brand is the operative word. If he just didn't change his deodorant for 30 years, that'd be different. Okay. Number 3, he gets panicky when the battery on his laptop drops below 30%. Number 4, his first DVD that he ever owned was The Matrix. Wow. Number 5, one of his annual family traditions is, you know where I'm going with this, is to eat haggis for breakfast the day after Christmas. If you don't know what haggis is, it consists of offal, which is spelled O-F-F-A-L and is A-W-F-U-L, offal, suet, oats with a fried egg on top. If you don't know what offal is, Google it. Number 6, one time when he was traveling and was in a hotel and woke up with searing pain in his shoulder, and the doctor came and gave him pain medicine and diagnosed what the problem was, and the problem was that he slept on his shoulder, which shows you he's over 40. Number 7, he is not a fan of camping. Quote, these are his words, "The whole point of vacation for me is not to find a manner of living that is less comfortable than normal life would be back home." He's not wrong. Last but not least, he describes himself as a, quote, loyal ambassador for Marmite, which I didn't even know what that was and had to Google it, and it is a British savory spread that you put on toast and crackers, and here's how the internet described it. Quote, "A sticky dark brown paste of concentrated yeast extract." So we could be praying for him. I just met Sam today, and but I have benefited from his ministry for many years now. He is such a gift to the Church of Jesus. He is godly and wise and smart. He is a clear thinker. He's an excellent communicator. He loves Jesus, and he knows deeply that Jesus loves him. And it is a real blessing for us to be able to have him and to have him lead us in this discussion this weekend. So, without further ado, Sam Allberry.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Matt Howell. How do you say your last name? Howell. Howell. I've done that thing where you say a word so many times it sounds really peculiar. But anyway, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's actually my first time in Memphis. I've been based in Nashville for about 5 years. Hadn't sort of made it this far west yet, so I'm glad to be in town. Marmite is as delicious as it sounded, by the way. It has the consistency and appearance and probably flavor of the stuff that they hose off stricken birds when there's been an oil spill somewhere. We voluntarily put that on our toast and eat it. In fact, I've got on my phone, there's quite a few friends where I will put some Marmite on toast and I will video them trying it. And of my American friends, maybe 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 doesn't absolutely hate it. So it's a very British thing. Every culture has something that they eat that the rest of the world is going, why on earth do you eat that? That's how I feel about Taco Bell, by the way. So we all have our own version of that. Thank you for having me this evening. Thank you for... We're looking at some delicate issues over the course of today and tomorrow morning. We're thinking about sexuality, the gospel of Jesus Christ, how those two things kind of interact and intersect. So thank you for trusting me with something that is, I know for many of us, a sensitive kind of issue. Thank you for caring about it. I know that sort of the goal of this time today and tomorrow is that as Christians we can do all we can to embody the grace and truth of Jesus. In every area of life, in every area where our culture is kind of fraught about something, we want to, as much as we can, embody the heart of Christ. That's our goal as Christians. We want to... He was full of grace and truth. We similarly want to be full of grace and truth. And so our kind of overarching goal for this weekend, the Lord helping us, is that we might think what it means to be faithful Christian kind of people when it comes to these kinds of topics. So that involves a number of things. It involves trying to be clear in our own mind what Jesus thinks about some of these things, what the scriptures have to say. It also involves thinking about how we best articulate that in the culture that we're in right now. It involves interacting with some of the ideas that we often find around us. And I know for so many of this is not an abstract theoretical issue. I speak on this every now and then, and pretty much every time I do, I can guarantee that there will be a vast number of people who have someone in their close orbit, someone in their family circle. Maybe it's a dear family friend, maybe it's a cherished work colleague, someone nearby you who identifies as LGBTQI or something in that kind of realm. And so I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about how we respond to family members who are taking particular positions on this, who are identifying in particular ways on this. So this is not theoretical. We're thinking about people very dear to us, faces that we love. But for a number of us, the issue is even closer to home than that. It's not just that there are people in our orbit who identify in some of these ways, but maybe for some of us, this is part of our own lived experience. Maybe this has been part of our own story, part of our own journey. That's been the case for me. When I was a teenager, before I came to Christ, I began to notice, it took me a little while, I'm slow, but I began to notice I was experiencing attractions towards some guys and not towards girls. This was in the early 90s. It was a very different kind of cultural time. We weren't really talking about these things at all, so I was just trying to figure this out in the confused privacy of my own mind. The first sort of, I guess, sign of this was when I was about 14. My kind of best friend at high school had just started dating a girl for the first time. It was a Monday morning at our high school, and Monday mornings were normally kind of catching up on each other's news and antics from the weekend, and he was saying, oh, I just got together with this girl and started dating her. And all of my friends were kind of, congratulating him. They were enthusiastic, and we were English, so that's a very muted kind of thing. We don't express ourselves terribly effusively, so enthusiasm for us is normally something like, so that's what we were doing, but my friends were kind of congratulating him, and for reasons I couldn't begin to articulate, I was feeling devastated. And I had no idea why. I hadn't consciously thought of my friend in any kind of romantic way, but somehow the thought of him being really close now to somebody else left me feeling just crushed inside, crushed in spirit. And over the next few years, I just began to realize that I was kind of, I guess, developing differently to many of my peers. The high school I was at was a boys-only school. There's a few of those around in the UK still. And that meant we only ever talked about two things. We talked about sport and we talked about girls. I'm no good at sport. I'm still convinced my center of gravity is somewhere outside of my body. I can't do anything that involves balance. And I discovered I wasn't very good at talking about girls either, because the kind of feelings my friends were describing, I wasn't experiencing. The kinds of romantic feelings they were kind of describing towards girls. I had girls that I was friends with. I just didn't have those physical attractions. And it was a painful process. I was at a stage in life where you're already quite self-conscious because you're a teenager. You really do want to fit in and be like everybody else. And in what seemed to be such a really defining moment of, area of life, I felt like I was the odd one out. And occasionally around the sort of group of friends, the question would circulate around the group, who do you like? And everyone always had an answer to that. Some people had multiple answers to that. And as that question would kind of work its way around the friendship circle, to me, I could feel the anxiety. Because I was expected to have a girl that I was pursuing, that I was interested in. And in those moments, I would sort of kind of panic for a moment and then think, just make up a name. Just any girl's name will do. So I would just sort of go, Denise. Yeah, I like Denise. Which would let me off the hook for about, 3 seconds before someone actually then said, well, who's Denise? And I'd have to say, well, yeah, you probably don't know her. She's not from around here. She's from Sweden. So no, you won't know her or have met her. I don't think it occurred to anyone that Denise is not a traditional Scandinavian girl's name, but there we go. But it was painful. When I was 17, I remember waiting for the school bus to take me home. And as I was stood on the roadside, I remember thinking to myself, I think I'm gay. I think that might be what this is. And I hadn't sort of thought about it in those terms up until that point. But as soon as I posed that question to myself, the answer seemed to be very obvious. I thought, well, I'm not having those romantic feelings towards girls. I am feeling something of that kind of ilk towards one or two of my male friends. So yeah, that must be what this is. And I was already beginning to apply to different universities and colleges, and all of those were in other cities. So my plan was, well, maybe when I go to university, I can begin to explore these feelings there. This is going to age me catastrophically to some of you, but this was before the internet. So it was quite plausible to lead a double life and think, well, my plan was maybe I could kind of explore these feelings at university and then no one at home would ever know. I knew that the schools I was applying to were, they had what were then called LGB societies. Didn't have the rest of the acronym yet. So that was what I was planning to do. But in between standing, waiting for the bus, and then eventually starting university, something else happened, which I hadn't planned for. I became a Christian. I hadn't meant to, kind of minding my own business. But I had a couple of good friends who were Christian believers. They invited me to their church's youth ministry, and I still remember the very first time I turned up. There were the usual church youth ministry type things, and pizza and a couple of games, that kind of thing. And then someone gave a presentation of the message of Jesus. And as soon as that person started to explain the message of Jesus, I began to realize that what I had imagined was Christianity was very different to what Jesus was talking about. I had assumed Christianity was about God coming down to congratulate good people. What I was starting to hear was that Christianity is all about Jesus coming to find lost people. And I was a pretty well-behaved teenager. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, and I judged people who did. But I began to realize that if God was real, if God existed, if God had made me, I had no idea who he was. And that I was probably supposed to. And I figured that was probably on me and not on him. And therefore, by definition, if God is real, I was lost. And so I felt very drawn to this message of Jesus. And over the coming weeks, began to sort of attend regularly, and it reached a point where I just began to understand his death and resurrection and realized I want to follow him. I want him to run my life. And so the summer before I was starting to think about university, I became a Christian. I became a follower of Jesus. Now, one of the first questions I had as a new Christian was, well, I wonder what Jesus thinks about sexuality. This was something I was, had begun to sort of think about for myself, and now I was following Jesus. I naturally was thinking, where does he land on this? What does he say? I had no idea. And so it wasn't something we were sort of talking about in my Christian circles. It wasn't something I felt I could ask about. So I just started reading one of the Gospels for myself. I figured that was a good thing to do anyway, and it wasn't a very sophisticated approach, but I thought, well, Matthew's first, so I'll start there. And I'll just see where Jesus lands on these issues. And I want to share a couple of scriptures in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus does address this topic. Now, it's interesting. A lot of people today think Jesus is neutral when it comes to sexuality. You'll often see these kind of memes going around the internet saying, well, Jesus had, big things to say about justice or the marginalized or the poor, but he was kind of very neutral when it comes to sexuality. But I only got, 4 or 5 chapters in before I realized Jesus has things to say. It's not the main thing he talks about, but when Jesus does talk about it, he has really significant things to say. So one example of that is Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28. There'll be a couple of these passages. I'll just read them out. If you've got a Bible on your phone and want to follow, you're welcome to do that as well. But in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, he's quoting one of the Old Testament commandments, one of the 10 commandments, and he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay, so Jesus in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, he's taking some of the 10 commandments from the Old Testament and he's showing how they've been misunderstood. And so he's saying, listen, this is what you've heard, but this is what it really means. He's not taking issue with the commandments themselves. He's taking issue with how they've been interpreted and received. And so he says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And Jesus' audience would have been going, yeah, we have heard that. We've been taught that. We know that. Maybe they were thinking, yeah, we've been pretty good on that one, actually. We haven't been unfaithful to our spouses. We haven't sort of messed around with anyone else's marriages. So they're probably wondering what Jesus has to say about it, and they might be feeling pretty good about it. But Jesus says, okay, so that's what you've heard, you shall not commit adultery, but I say, and maybe just for a moment they were starting to think, I wonder where Jesus is going to go with this. You know, you've been told don't commit adultery, but... And if it was up to our kind of culture today to complete the sentence of what Jesus says, we would have Jesus saying, I say to you, you've got to follow your heart. Or love is love. Or something like that. You've got to be true to yourself. What Jesus actually says is, I say to you, everyone who looks at another person with lustful intent has already committed adultery with that person in their heart. In other words, Jesus is saying, you've been told not to commit adultery, and you've assumed that means you must not physically commit adultery. And Jesus is saying, actually, the real issue isn't just what you do with your body. The real issue is what you do with your eyes and how you look at someone. It's what you do with your mind and how you think about someone. Jesus takes that Old Testament command and he doesn't put it to one side. He actually intensifies it. And part of what Jesus is doing in this part of the Sermon on the Mount is he's trying to show how the Ten Commandments weren't given to us so that we could prove to God how obedient we can be. They were given to the people of God in the Old Testament so that we would all realize any relationship we were going to have with God was going to have to be based on his forgiveness and not our performance. Because Jesus is saying that those commandments are meant to make us realize that in our hearts, we just can't naturally keep them. So here's what's going on. Jesus is trying to show us that in our hearts, what we do is commit adultery. In other words, we use other people's sexuality as a commodity, as something that exists to satisfy our own desires. We turn it into a consumable. And Jesus says this is just what the human heart does. In our hearts, we go against how God has designed human sexuality to work. In other words, if we're really tracking with what Jesus is saying, he is saying every single one of us is an adulterer in our hearts. We're all people who we look at other people lustfully. So I began to realize that, this verse in Matthew is basically putting all of us in the same boat. Whatever our particular sexual attractions might be, Jesus is saying all of us, by nature, are adulterous. We're all sexual sinners. Every one of us is going to need Jesus to show us grace and mercy in this part of our lives. So he's leveling the playing field. If we understand what he's saying, it's humbling. It's searching. It's convicting. But here's the other thing. If Jesus is saying something about the person doing the lustful looking, by implication, he's also saying something about the person being looked at. And this is why I love Jesus, because he's able to convict us of our sin and dignify us at the same time. Because Jesus is saying about the person being looked at that they have a sexual dignity that matters so much to him, it mustn't be violated even in the privacy of someone else's mind. So Jesus cares how you look at other people, and Jesus cares how other people look at you. So he's saying each of us is a sexual sinner, and each of us has some kind of sexual dignity that he's protective of. Someone might be looking at you in that kind of way. You may have no idea that they're doing it. But Jesus does. And it matters to him. How people think about you matters to Jesus. Next, I began to see, and this is in Matthew chapter 15, that Jesus regards any sexual intimacy outside of marriage as being sinful. Now, this one is a bit less obvious. I didn't kind of put all the pieces together, the first time I read this verse. But it is what Jesus is saying. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the scribes. Those were people who, they took sin really, really seriously. And their belief was that sin is out there and needs to be avoided. It's like a contagion. It's like a virus or something. And so they had this whole kind of system of people and places and things that you must avoid in order to not get contaminated by sin. And so they had this sort of intricate religious sort of system of things that had to be ceremonially cleansed and all of that kind of thing. And Jesus shows up and he blows that way of thinking out of the water, because Jesus turns up and he says in Matthew 15 verse 19 that sin isn't out there to be avoided. It actually comes out of our own hearts. So he says in verse 19, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person." So Jesus is saying, listen, if you want to take sin seriously, you have to come to terms with your own heart, because your heart is where sin comes from. You are a contagion. If you want to avoid sin, you've got to avoid yourself. Which, blew their entire religious system out of the water. You can see why they wanted to crucify him. And Jesus provides a sort of few examples of, a few kind of symptoms that are, evidences that our hearts are naturally sinful. He says, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. That's not a set menu. That's just a few examples of how our sinful hearts show themselves. Now, one of the things on the list there is sexual immorality. Matthew wrote his gospel in Greek, and the Greek word there is a word called porneia, which is where we get the word pornography from. And at the time of Jesus, that word porneia simply meant sexual intimacy outside the covenant of marriage. It was a kind of a catch-all term. It was an umbrella term. It would have included adultery, which Jesus mentions separately as well here. It would have included prostitution, and it would have included sexual intimacy between two people of the same sex. It would have included any kind of sexual intimacy outside the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman. There are not just Bible scholars who will show you that that's what the word meant. There are non-Christian, scholars of ancient history that verify that. So Jesus is saying that any sexual behavior outside of marriage is sinful. It's against God's design for us. Now, he doesn't mention same-sex kind of romantic relationships or sexual relationships, but the language he's using would have been understood by everyone to have included it. Well, the final bit of Matthew I wanted to share with you is Matthew chapter 19, where again the Pharisees are around and they come up to Jesus to test him. And this always kind of, just makes me wonder, because can you imagine what it would have been like to have Jesus in your locality, walking around? You could just go up to him, you could ask him anything, and he's there. And the Pharisees decide the best use of Jesus being physically among them is to try and trick him. I saw a sort of a cartoon, imagining someone explaining a smartphone to someone, 50 years ago, and saying what it does, and like, yeah, this thing contains, oh, my flashlight is on, contains that. I've never understood why that does that. There we go. No. There we go. If a 7-year-old wants to show me how to do that, I'll appreciate that. But yeah, so you imagine explaining a smartphone to someone going, yeah, this thing contains all human knowledge. And then they go, oh, wow, that's amazing. What do you use it for? And you kind of go, well, games and pictures of cats. And it's like, Jesus, God himself is walking among us. What do we do with that? Let's try and trick him. And so what they ask Jesus is, in Matthew 19, verse 3, they say, hey, Jesus, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Now, that was just a really loaded question at that time. That was an issue of massive controversy within the sort of Jewish world. There were different rabbinic schools that landed in different places. This is what sort of first century Twitter was arguing about. And so they're thinking, if we can just get Jesus to say something on this contentious issue, then whatever he says, we can use that against him. Someone will be offended and we can play into that. So that's what they're trying to do. But Jesus answers with some really significant words. Jesus answered them, and how gracious Jesus was to answer them. He didn't have to. He could have ignored them. They're not asking in good faith. But Jesus says to them, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, lots of things going on there. What we need to notice is Jesus is asked a question about divorce, and he answers by talking about marriage. Jesus is saying you're not going to understand divorce unless you understand marriage, which is why he quotes Genesis 2. A man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, they will become one flesh, and God has joined them together. That's serious. But there's more going on, because Jesus doesn't just go back to Genesis 2, he goes back to Genesis 1 and talks about how from the beginning God has made us male and female. In other words, Jesus is saying you're not going to understand divorce unless you understand marriage, and you're not going to understand marriage unless you understand gender. Unless you understand that God has created us sexually different as men and women. So Jesus' logic is God has created us male and female from the beginning, not just in the beginning, but not since then, but from the beginning, ever since then, God has made us male and female. Therefore, we have this thing called marriage. Jesus is saying it's because we've been made sexually different as men and women, it's because of that we get married. He's not saying that because we're sexually different, we have to get married. Jesus himself wasn't married. But he is saying we can only have marriage because this sexual difference exists. In other words, Jesus is defining marriage on the basis of it involving sexual difference. So for Jesus, marriage by necessity is between a man and a woman. That is the one flesh union. Now, in the Western world right now, it's probably hard to find a more controversial statement from Jesus than that. For many parts of the Western world, the idea that, marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's the only true definition of marriage, that is just unfathomably offensive to so many people. So let me just say a couple of things about what Jesus is saying here. The first thing for us to notice about this claim of Jesus is that Jesus' teaching on marriage is countercultural today because Jesus' teaching on marriage has always been countercultural in one way or another. In any cultural context, what Jesus says about marriage is going to rub some people up the wrong way, because in some cultures it's controversial that Jesus says marriage is between a man and one woman rather than between a man and several women. There are some cultural contexts where Jesus' teaching on marriage is controversial because the role of the husband is to sacrificially lay down his life for his wife. And that the Christian husband isn't the one who lays down the law, he's the one who lays down his life. And he is the one who has to go first to do that. There are cultural contexts where that is countercultural. And for our cultural time in the West, it's countercultural that Jesus says one man and one woman rather than a man and a man or a woman or some other sort of number of people. But Jesus' teaching has always been countercultural. Ours is not the first culture to react against it. Which is what we would expect if Jesus' words are actually coming to us from outside of human wisdom, but from God himself. You would expect those words to not fit in neatly with any one human culture. But the other thing to notice is that Jesus' teaching on marriage here isn't arbitrary. It's not like Jesus was, just having to sort of go with the cultural flow and say it's between a man and a woman. We know Jesus is happy to be, very countercultural in lots of different ways. It's not like he was thinking, well, I've got to come down one way or the other on the whole definition of marriage thing, and kind of mentally flips a coin and decides man and woman. No, there's something significant in the whole Bible about this union between a man and a woman. In the Bible, that union, that combination has always meant something unique. Right at the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1, you have this amazing, epic account of creation. It's all very, wide angle lens. It's, ecosystems and planets and species and special effects and all of that kind of stuff. And then in Genesis 2, we suddenly zoom right in on one garden and a guy and a girl getting together. And the question we should ask is, why after that sort of massive, epic kind of overture in Genesis 1, why is the first human scene a guy and a girl getting together? And the rest of the Bible shows us the reason is because that union between a man and a woman is a picture of the eventual union between heaven and earth. That guy and girl getting together is a picture of what the whole Bible's going to be about. It's a picture about what God is doing in the universe, that he is forming a bride for his son, Jesus Christ. And so as the Old Testament unfolds, we discover God isn't simply the deity in heaven. He is a husband. He's a groom. He makes amazing covenant promises to his beloved. We discover, too, that his people are not merely his subjects, they're his bride. Often, sadly, his unfaithful bride. When Jesus arrives in the Gospels, he doesn't merely describe himself as the Son of God or the Redeemer or the Christ. He describes himself as the bridegroom. Jesus is saying, I am that divine husband from the Old Testament that you've been waiting for. I've come now to bring that relationship into reality. Throughout the New Testament, we see our relationship to Jesus as believers being described in marital terminology. Paul says that just as a man and a woman are one flesh in sexual union, so too we and Jesus are one spirit. Paul talks to husbands and wives in Ephesians chapter 5, and he then says, guys, I'm actually talking about Jesus and the church. That's what this is about. And the Bible reaches its kind of crescendo in the end of Revelation with what? With the marriage supper of Christ and his bride, with the new Jerusalem coming from heaven to earth as a bride adorned for her husband. The eventual union of heaven and earth through Jesus Christ being one with his people. And so marriage in the Bible has always had that extra kind of significance. It points beyond itself to something more. So Jesus isn't just sort of being arbitrary or random. So as a newish believer, I began to realize, okay, if I'm going to follow Jesus and be obedient to what he teaches, he says all of us are sexual sinners. Any sexual intimacy outside of marriage is sinful, and marriage is between a man and a woman. So I began to realize that if I was going to be faithful to Jesus, it wouldn't be right for me to explore my sexual feelings. I just had to say no to them. So the question then was, well, what am I going to do? Do I continue following Jesus now that I know that? Or do I kind of, break up with Jesus and go, well, it was nice while it lasted, but actually this really matters to me? Well, probably won't surprise you, given this is a church and I'm speaking, that I chose to follow with what Jesus says. But to many people today, that would be just a no-brainer. If it's a choice between fulfilling your sexuality and following some religious leader, you've got to fulfill your sexuality. I mean, there's nothing more important to being a whole and complete human being than that. So let me give you 3 quick reasons why following Jesus was the right thing to do, and why it would be the right thing for someone in a similar situation today. Here's the first reason: because of who Jesus is. Now again, if you frame it as fulfilling your sexuality or following a religious leader, you're not really understanding what we're talking about. Because Jesus to us is not some religious leader. To the Christian believer, Jesus is the one who made us. He's the one who created us. And what we mean by that is not merely that Jesus assembled us. No, when we say Jesus, is the creator, what that means is Jesus thought you up. Jesus came up with the idea of you. And he was having a good day when he did. So that means Jesus knows you better than you know yourself. He actually loves you more than you love yourself. We see from what Jesus says and does that Jesus is more committed to our ultimate joy than even we are. And if that is true, it would be foolish not to follow him. And I'd realize as a 17, 18-year-old that Jesus had died for me and risen from the grave for me. And I knew he was going to do a much better job of running my life than I was. I knew I could trust him. And I say all that because those friends of mine who don't share my Christian beliefs and who are puzzled by my lifestyle choices, I need them to know, listen, I'm doing what I do because of who Jesus is. And the Christian life is never going to make complete sense to anyone unless they get who Jesus is to us. Somebody once said, those who hear not the music think the dancer's mad. And it's true. If you look at a music video and take away the volume, it looks really weird. Those who hear not the music think the dancer's mad. And those who see what Christians do and don't understand who Jesus is think we're mad. Every now and then, if I'm talking about this, particularly maybe on a college campus or somewhere like that, someone will come up to me inevitably and say, listen, you just can't believe those things today. And I'll go, yeah, I know. I get that. I really do. But what I'll say to them is this. I'll say, listen, you may not realize this is what's going on, but you're actually telling me to not be a follower of Jesus. Because the reason I believe these things about marriage is because I follow him, and it's what he teaches. I believe what I believe about marriage because I believe what I believe about Jesus. Do you have the authority to tell me to stop following Jesus? And most people in that kind of context will go, yeah, okay, fair enough, I didn't know that was what this was, so no, I'm not going to tell you to stop following Jesus. But every now and then, someone will go, yeah, if that's what Jesus teaches, you shouldn't follow him. Which then actually makes the rest of the conversation very easy, because I'll just say to them, okay, please tell me what you've got going for you that Jesus doesn't have going for him, such that I should follow what you say on this part of life and not what he says. You know, he died for me and rose again. That's where the bar is currently set. If you can improve on that, I mean, I'm genuinely interested. But that's what you're up against. Because I want people to realize that their issue isn't with me, their issue isn't with the church, their issue isn't with some abstraction called Christianity. Their issue's with Jesus. And if my beliefs bother them, it's because Jesus is bothering them. So because of who Jesus is, the second reason why this was the right choice to make is because of how Jesus calls all of us. You may remember in Mark's Gospel, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The key word in that verse is the word anyone. If anyone will come after Jesus, they have to deny self. They have to say a radical no to their own self. Jesus doesn't put the word self in front of fulfillment. He doesn't put the word self in front of identity. He doesn't put the word self in front of actualization. He puts it in front of denial. The thing we need to do with our self is to deny it. That means saying no to some of our deepest yearnings and longings and ambitions. And Jesus says that's the case for all of us. In the next verse, he says, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. In other words, and I love Jesus' honesty here, he's saying there are going to be times when following him feels like he's killing you. There are going to be times when it feels like Jesus is taking your life away from you. And yet the longer we go on in the Christian life, the more we look back on those times to think, no, actually Jesus was giving life to me in those seasons. Saying no to myself was actually helping me become the person I was always meant to be in his eyes. It's kind of paradoxical, but the way to truly be yourself is to deny self and say yes to Jesus. But it does mean every single one of us who follows Jesus has to say no to some pretty big things in our own heart. Someone said to me once, yeah, well, you know, the gospel's harder for you because it goes against who you are. And I said, well, sexuality is not who I am. Thank you very much. But secondly, if you think the gospel of Jesus has somehow slotted neatly into your life, I don't think it's the gospel of this Jesus you've received. Because Jesus demands everything from all of us. Someone else said to me once, are you telling me Jesus is telling me to give him my sexuality? And I said, no, it's much worse than that. Jesus wants your whole life. He believes he's worthy of nothing less than that. He actually believes there's no part of your life that's going to be improved by holding it back from him. So if you think the cost of following Jesus is too much for your LGBT friends, you think it's too much for anyone, and you're not counting the cost of following him in your own life. Jesus calls all of us the same way. Even in the area of sexuality, all of us are going to have to say no to some of our sexual feelings. But the final reason is because of what Jesus alone can give us. And there's a lot of things we could say on this. I'm just going to say one thing, which is what Jesus promises in John chapter 6, because he says, in verse 35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Now, you may well know, if you've looked at John's Gospel, there are several times when Jesus makes a sort of big I am statement. He says, I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And with most of those I am statements, I kind of, hear them and go, oh, yes, that's big. I need that. Jesus is the good shepherd, and I'm an idiot sheep. I need him to be the good shepherd. Or Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and I'm confused about where to go in life. I need him. But when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, it's sometimes hard to know what we're supposed to do with that. And so Jesus comes up to us and goes, I'm the bread of life. And we kind of go, okay, well done, I guess. I like bread. Does that help? I was out for lunch with a friend recently, and we went out, and a waiter came up to us and said, would you like any bread for the table? And we both were like, no, we're good for now. That's what bread means to us. And so when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, we think he's saying, would you like a bit of religion for the table? But in the time of Jesus, if you didn't have bread, you didn't live. No bread meant no life. You would spend your working day ensuring you would have bread for tomorrow. So when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, what he's actually saying is, I am to your soul what bread is to a starving stomach. When Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, what he's saying is, I am the one relationship that can ultimately satisfy you. When he says, I'm the bread of life, he's saying there is nothing else in this world that can actually truly fill us in the way that Jesus can. And we need to hear that, because in our cultural moment right now, we're being told romantic fulfillment is the bread of life. That is the one thing without which you cannot truly live. So as Matt outed me as being in my 40s. One of the things that means I get to do is to say to the generation that is younger than me, some of you are here tonight, if you marry someone, if you get together with someone, thinking that person is going to fulfill all of your emotional and romantic needs, you are going to be a nightmare to be married to. Because Jesus is the bread of life. That person isn't. You're putting a burden on that person they were never designed to bear. And your expectations will either crush them or be crushed by them. No, Jesus is saying he is the bread of life. He is actually what our hearts are most deeply yearning for. Now, I've never got married. Most of my friends have, and there are times when I go around to visit married friends of mine, and I sort of see family life, and I think, oh man, this is awesome. Part of me wishes I had that. That would be really cool. There are other times with the same families where I'm like, oh boy, okay, how long do I have to stay before it's rude for me to leave, And I'll kind of head home going, I'm so glad I'm single. I really am. The real win in life isn't a perfect marriage, a perfect romantic relationship. The real win is getting Jesus. Let me close by saying in Philippians 3, Paul says, he's kind of giving us his big resolution for his whole life. He says, I want to know Christ. And we're thinking, Paul, you're an apostle, for crying out loud. If you don't know him, no one does. You actually do know him. You wrote the book of Romans, and presumably you understood it. I think you know Jesus, but what Paul is saying is the more you know Christ, the more you want nothing more than to know him even more. And just maybe to become a bit more like him, because he is the bread of life. he is the one who can truly satisfy. So because of who Jesus is, because of how he calls all of us, and because of what he alone can offer, there's just nothing better we can do with our lives, with our sexuality, with whatever it is, than to follow him.